All right, everybody. I'm your host, Eric Smith, and you're at the Unfiltered Truth podcast. I'm joined today by my cohort, my partner in crime, James Shook, owner of Zenith Jiu-Jitsu in Ackworth, and Lance LoRusso. And this week, Lance is our first real guest on the show. We're super happy to have him. Last week, for those of y'all that didn't catch the episode, we covered all things Second Amendment and self-defense tactics. James, you want to kind of do a quick recap of last week? We'll get to it.
Yeah, I think one of the great things we covered last week was just getting some information out to viewers that may not be as experienced with weapons and may not have been as confident carrying a gun or carrying a weapon on them in a public environment. So it was good to get some of that information out. We got some good feedback from the viewers last week as well. So today, having a guest, I think maybe we can get the comments rolling a little more. If any of you viewers out there watching, make sure that you push any questions you can to us. Try to stay on topic as much as you can. We'll have some highlights and some bullet points that we'll be going over specifically. So if you guys can try to stay in, with that segment of the broadcast at any given point, we can try to address as many questions as possible.
Outstanding. And again, joined by our distinguished guest, Lance LoRusso. Lance, just kind of give everybody a little bit of your background, and we'll kind of get into it.
I'm a little pressured now. Before I was a guest, now I'm a distinguished guest.
Right.
I can't handle all the stress. So I'm Lance LoRusso. I'm an attorney. I've been practicing about 21 years. Been involved in law enforcement since 1987. Worked for Cobb County Police for many years. Then worked for the Solicitor General's office in Cobb, and have been involved in training law enforcement for probably since 1990. I've been a firearms instructor for law enforcement for close to 30 years. I've represented, as of very recently, 99 officers involved in officer-involved shootings or critical incidents. Teach about 2,000 cops a year before the zombie apocalypse and COVID hit throughout the United States and Canada. Spoken to the Canadian Police Association and several other different groups throughout the United States. So written a few books on use of force and what officers go through. The proceeds from a lot of those books go to law enforcement charities, and just enjoy coming today. I'm looking forward to all the topics we're going to talk about.
Awesome. Some books Lance has written. If you all the audience haven't read them, I definitely recommend going and checking them out. You got Hunting of Men, Parallax True Crime Tales, Blue News, Peacemaking, and When Cops Kill. When Cops Kill is the first book of Lance's I read when I was a police officer. It gave me a lot of insight to what happens after an officer-involved shooting and kind of everything that goes along with it, and actually benefited me quite greatly later on in my career when I was an officer involved in one of those incidents. So it's not just for police officers. It's all his books are for everybody. It's good for everyone to read about them. They give a lot of good insight. So I highly encourage you all to read them for sure. So one thing we kind of wanted to cover today, Lance, was the origin of use of force policies and statutes, not just in Georgia where we all happen to live, but just kind of throughout the nation and where these all came from, because the public, it seemed non-law enforcement people seem to have some issues or some questions about, why are these policies in place? Where did they come from and why are they there? And if any insight you can give into them would be sincerely appreciated.
Sure. So generally throughout the United States, there's very little difference between when law enforcement officers can use force, specifically deadly force, and when the public can use force, specifically deadly force. There's really only two instances where the general public can't use force, but law enforcement can. One of them is people escaping from correctional institutes. If you and your family are driving to Wally World and see a guy in stripes jump a fence near a correctional institute and run, you should probably just call 911, whereas the guard in the tower may be able to use deadly force to stop them. The other one is whether or not a private citizen can use deadly force to stop a fleeing forcible felon. The Garner versus Tennessee decision basically outlines that law enforcement under certain circumstances can use deadly force there. Does that apply to private citizens making a citizen's arrest? We can have another podcast with a bar behind us and we can all have a beer and discuss it. I just don't know the answer. But generally, you can use deadly force or really any force to stop a force being used against yourself or a third person, or deadly force to stop a forcible felony. So people ask all the time, well, what if somebody's, robbing me at gunpoint? Well, that's a forcible felony. What if I come home and somebody's running out the back door with my television? That's not a forcible felony. That's a property crime, so you can't use deadly force to stop them. You would be able to use some force to protect your property and protect yourself in that situation, or to stop the crime. But when we start talking about deadly force, the origin of those case law and origin of the statutes comes from just a legislative pronouncement of valuing life above property, and also valuing the life of a person who is not doing anything to commit a crime, balanced against a person who is committing a crime, which is not only a crime against the individual, it's a crime against society. Now, the reason law enforcement has a little bit of different rules is the origin of the use of force by law enforcement stems from the fact that law enforcement are government agents, whether they're city, county, state, local, whatever they happen to be, or federal. And the use of force by law enforcement is governed by the Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution. So the Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution spells out that use of law enforcement force, whether it's deadly force or non-deadly force, is a seizure under law. So if I, as a law enforcement officer, put somebody in handcuffs, that's what we see in Bookham Dano and all the stuff we see on TV, obviously everybody gets that's a seizure. But if I use any type of force, specifically deadly force, to seize somebody, stop their movement, stop them from moving forwards, backwards, keep them from leaving the area, that is a seizure under the Fourth Amendment. So when you go into all of the statutes, and even in Georgia, if we're looking at statutes for use of force for law enforcement and private citizens, it's about 5 or 6 of them that we string together. But when you go into a state's statutory scheme, it's going to have for law enforcement that underlying underpinning of the Fourth Amendment reasonableness standard of that seizure. So you may see some words tweaked here or there, but generally they're going to be not a dime's difference between the two. When we start talking about private citizens using force, we also have to recognize that the states have the ability to limit the use of force by citizens. But as Ron Popeil would say, wait, there's more. Because we have a federal constitution and then we have state constitutions. So with regard to state constitutions, we have 50 different varieties of what that seizure by a government agent would mean. And then on top of that, we have citizens' arrest powers. But a citizen making an arrest is still not acting as a government agent. So, kind of a long answer to a short question, which is kind of what lawyers do. So, it's just a matter of looking at the legislative scheme and making decisions, policy decisions based on the statutes. The most recent policy decision that everybody looks at, some of these statutes have been around since Wyatt Earp was cleaning up Tombstone, but the most recent legislative decision that was made was the stand your ground laws. So they do get changed from time to time.
Awesome. Yeah, I was going to ask you that. Speaking of policy changes and use of force changes and things like that, coming along right now, what kind of trends are you seeing as far as policies and laws gearing towards police officers that are changing in today's climate?
Sure. Well, the Defund the Police movement, which kind of makes me wonder if people spouting it don't have walking around sense. They clearly don't know what they're talking about. There's only 2 things discretionary in police budgets, and that's training and travel, which is generally for training. People to go to the specialized crime scene processing class in Michigan that's the best of the world, or go to the homicide detectives going to a body farm. There's only 2 or 3 of them in the United States. So if you cut budgets of law enforcement, you still have things that are non-negotiable. You still have salaries. You still have mandatory training. You have uniforms. You have patrol cars. You have gas for patrol cars. All of those hard systems that you have in place, everything from computers to ticket readers and license plate scanners, all of those have to be there anyway. Now, in light of the salaries and hourly rates we have to pay, because we've been having a large drop in law enforcement numbers and a large drop in recruiting, the past several months have hardly been a recruiting video for law enforcement throughout the United States. The more you have a drop in numbers, the more you have overtime. Well, anybody here who owns a business knows that overtime costs more than straight pay. So cutting budgets is going to force police administrators to reduce training and reduce travel for training, which is the same thing that these advocates, and that's a good word that I could use for these folks, these advocates are saying they claim to want more training. So in their zeal to get on Facebook and scream and holler and rant like true keyboard warriors, they're actually going to defeat their own purposes.
Yeah, I think you make a very good point there, Lance. That's one thing James and I kind of hit on, and I'm going to have him give you a follow-up question on this one. Our very first podcast that we did, we talked about that very topic, about how the defunding the police movement and taking away their training, and taking away good training at that, because like you said, those are one of those few things you can cut from a budget from a law enforcement standpoint is going to absolutely hurt police officers. Thank goodness there's business owners like James out there who offers, basically free training to police departments and can help combat that, but not everybody's going to do that. Not every business owner has the time or resources. So, James, I'll leave this one with you.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we did with our Kennesaw Police Department here in Cobb County is we were able to bring them in, try to work out a deal for them so that they could, in some ways afford to put it into their budget just so they would even have the training. Obviously training is going to cost money. If we're talking defund the police, I think Lance pointed out several things that a lot of the public might not think of right away. Some of those things would be the fuel for the vehicles. If you want your officers to be these super officers that do no wrong or can make no mistakes whatsoever, then obviously they're going to have additional training with that. One of the things that I've seen, and we talked about off air a little bit, was the general lack of respect. And I know we mentioned it in a previous podcast, the general lack of respect for law enforcement. And, when you have and we'll ask this question directly to Lance, when you have a citizen, whether they are right or wrong, and they're in a confrontation with law enforcement officers, to me, I just feel like there's been a massive breakdown in the way people are behaving or the way they conduct themselves in the presence of a law enforcement officer. Maybe you could speak a little bit on how you feel as to, number one, why law enforcement may be not respected as much, coming from just a ground level citizen that has an interaction with them, and then maybe what some of the solutions could be to maybe help the public understand that law enforcement officers have an extremely dangerous job. It's a job where you don't know who you're dealing with. You don't know the actual person or any background on them. So caution's going to be, utmost when you first make contact with these folks. And I think sometimes the public doesn't, take that into account, and they don't give the officer credit for some of that, which leads later to maybe a citizen treating an officer like another citizen, where they would actually maybe put their hands on them. They would, speak to them in a very derogatory manner. And obviously this is a breakdown of society and inside the household a lot. But what do you think are some of the pointers maybe that you could give on what the public could do to better understand this? Maybe treat officers with a little more respect, maybe even try to keep themselves out of these situations so that you don't have the aftermath that results.
Sure. Let me just add one thing to what both of you said about law enforcement suffering from a lack of training. The real people who are going to suffer will be the public. So Absolutely. When something happens in your neighborhood and somebody's murdered, the fact that a detective was only able to get minimal training for a 5-year period and wasn't able to go to advanced schools to investigate a homicide is not going to hurt that detective. It's going to hurt the public who's wondering why they haven't apprehended the person who murdered somebody in their neighborhood. The issue about the respect for law enforcement is really interesting, because I remember a few years ago, there was a Harris County deputy in Texas who was murdered while he was getting gas. And you'll find that I tend not to say shot in the line of duty or killed in the line of duty. Yes, that's true. But these folks were murdered because they were wearing a uniform. And that, to me, that's much more of a hard reality to face, and much more of a reality that people need to realize, because the next day, I tend to ask, what does the department do the day after an officer is murdered on duty? And the answer is the rest of that group of people who survived go to work the next day wearing the same uniform somebody shot at. So in that situation, it was Harris County, Texas. He was gassing up his car, and he was just slaughtered. Somebody just came up and ambushed him and killed him. About 2 weeks later, there was a Harris County deputy who was filling up his car, and an older gentleman was standing there, just standing next to his car. And, he's an older guy. He looked like, from the pictures I saw, he's in his 60s or 70s. And he said, sir, is there something I can help you with? He said, no, son, I'm just watching your back. So I can tell you, as much as you hear what I call a cacophony of ignorance, because if you want to get on YouTube, if you want to get on social media, just act like an idiot. And as much as you see these people acting out, and we'll talk a little bit later about how they're acting out, and that I think it's part of a coordinated effort. But as much as you see that, for every one of those numbnuts you see, I can tell you my estimate is there's 100 to 1,000 people who support the police. But why don't you see them out there screaming and hollering at protests or at riots? Because non-peaceful protests are riots. It's a 4-letter word, but it's appropriate here. So they're out working. They're taking care of their families. They're doing what they should be doing. And quite frankly, the peaceful protesters are good people. They have a right to protest. They have a First Amendment right to redress the government for a petition of grievances. And if that means they want to stand on the Capitol steps with signs and scream and holler at people, as long as they don't violate any laws, that's what our country was founded on. There are a group of protesters in 1776 who caused much of a stir, throwing a bunch of tea into Boston Harbor too. At the time, I think that they were seen as rioting. But, when you start burning down buildings, when you start throwing bricks and rocks and bottles at police officers, that leads to a breakdown of society, James. And it's exactly what you said. And the other side of that, and I think the public recognizes it's a problem, but the other side of that is a police officer who comes home at the end of her shift and has to strip her uniform off in the garage because her uniform is covered in urine and feces because people have been throwing it at her while she's standing on a line trying to protect legal protesters. So, the breakdown in society, I think, comes from a bunch of different places. I think that we have people who are intentionally pushing those boundaries. We have people who are pressing contacts with law enforcement. James, I'll give you an example. You pick somebody out from your studio who's been studying martial arts for 20 years. They are probably the most laid back individual, but I could get them to fight. I could push them hard enough and they will hurt me. But what would it take? And that's essentially what you see is people keep pushing that envelope as hard as they can, trying to get a reaction out of law enforcement while they've got a phone in their hand so they can be the next YouTube sensation. And it's been going on for a long time. I've seen too many videos of, I'm not going to give you my license till you tell me why you stopped me. Call a supervisor. I don't have to do this. I don't have to do that. Some of the people are very intelligent and just, making an assertion. They're wrong, but it's an assertion. And then some of the people, probably filled out their driver's license application in crayon. So I don't think those folks were smart enough to come up with that list of questions on their own. And I think some of those are truly part of a coordinated effort to try to get the officers riled up or try to get them to do something. Now, here's the other side of that, and it kind of goes to your point about where did this breakdown occur? So let's put the general public on the outside of that car stopping a patrol car, stopping a violator. So I stop Eric. Eric's not happy he got stopped. Eric's late for work. That's why he was speeding. That's the old joke. Why were you speeding? Because I'm late for work. Why do you think I was speeding? So I stop Eric. Eric says, here's my driver's license. Hey, I'm sorry. If you could give me a warning, that'd be great. But I messed up. The officer writes him a ticket, goes and runs him, comes back, hands him a ticket. Let's go to another scenario where Eric says, I'm not telling you anything about me. I'm not telling you where I'm going. I'm not telling you why I was speeding, and I'm not giving you my ID. Any reasonable law enforcement officer, well-trained officer in that situation would start with their spidey senses going up. And I love when people say, well, I'm not doing anything wrong. Well, here's a clue. The officer does not know that. I've trained thousands of police officers. I've visited hundreds of police agencies, either virtually or by visiting them. And I have never heard of an agency that requires clairvoyance as part of their hiring process. So you can't walk up and decide, James is a good guy. He's never done anything wrong in his life. So when you start obstructing what is your obligation, for example, in most states, You have to show your driver's license if you're stopped. You don't get to say no. The driver's license doesn't belong to you, it belongs to the state that issued it. So when you start obstructing the officer's reasonable investigation, the rest of society, the rest of the world wants the officer to start asking more questions and start wondering why you won't cooperate. Maybe your buddies that you're down in the basement eating Cheetos with, and maybe your mom thinks you're special. But if you just showed them your driver's license, maybe you don't know why they stopped you. And here's an idea. Maybe you didn't do anything wrong. Maybe you were stopped because you fit the description of somebody else who did something wrong. So, when we talk about constitutional rights are a contract between the government and individuals. And there's a great case called Graham versus Connor, where the Supreme Court, 1989, set this case out and discussed, the relative rights of the public and the relative rights of the police. And, there were three or four interests in Graham. One was an officer to be able to go home at night without getting killed. The paramount right was a private citizen to be able to go about their lawful business without being arrested or without being disturbed by the police. Another one is for the government to be able to enforce its laws. So we have a breakdown when citizens refuse to cooperate with law enforcement because we judge the officer's action in that situation from the perspective of a reasonable officer, not a reasonable person. Because the reasonable people do not know, for instance, putting your hands in your pockets on a traffic stop sets an officer's spidey senses off. Refusing to give information when the officer just stopped you because you ran a red light makes them wonder, did you get into a wreck? Did you leave the scene of a wreck? Did you at least just leave a domestic violence case? So, it's not just a breakdown in people understanding what their obligations as a citizen are. It really is a concerted effort to try to see if they can poke the bear, if you will.
Yep. I agree with you 100% on that, Lance. We've seen it over and over again where, these people are constantly pushing the police officers into confrontations. And kind of to your point about the general public supporting police, as you know, I was undercover for many years, came back to uniform patrol shortly after the Dallas PD massacre where those officers were all murdered. And other than post 9/11, I never saw more support vocally from the public when those kind of things were going on. Same thing during the Ferguson incidents and things like that. That's when I saw the most support as a police officer. That's when I had the most amount of people come up to me. It didn't matter what their race, creed, nationality, anything was. I would have people almost weekly or semi-daily come up to my car, like, can I pray with you? Can I talk to you? Can I buy you lunch? All these things, because I think you're absolutely right. For every one agitator there is out there or one rioter, you're going to have 10, 100, or 1,000 other people that kind of feel differently because of their personal beliefs, and they're either afraid to speak out or, like you said, sometimes just too busy to speak out. Yeah,
and it's interesting. It's a little bit of it's peer pressure.
Sure.
But, we see people defying that peer pressure all the time. We've seen, and I'm trying to remember what city it was in now, but we saw somebody, I'm not even going to mention the name of the group because I don't like to give them any airtime,
Yep.
But there was a very violent group that is causing problems at most of these places. They're destroying businesses. And this guy walked up in the middle of a peaceful protest, took out a hammer and started to smash the asphalt so he could have something to throw at people. And a group of peaceful protesters picked him up and dragged him to the police and handed him to the police. And I think more and more we've seen that. We've also seen groups around the time of Ferguson. We saw groups of peaceful protesters standing in front of a line of officers to make sure nobody hurt them. The bottom line is, and this kind of goes back to your question, James, those words, defund the police, I think scared and woke up a lot of the average citizens who run businesses, who have kids in school, who want to know that there's a law enforcement officer that's going to be that 4-minute response away, not someone who is going to be 45 minutes away because they're so shorthanded because nobody wants the job anymore.
Yeah, and you've touched on a lot of those things. The general public, as far as I'm concerned, and the people that I interact with on a daily basis, as a matter of fact, I had a few inquiries come in today into my jiu-jitsu academy, And as these potential customers came in the door and we got to talking for a moment, they had kind of overseen a few things, and they asked me about law enforcement, what my support was of law enforcement. And once I told them, some of my background and what we've been doing for law enforcement and whatnot, they were extremely excited. The first thing they said was, we're, very much supporters of law enforcement. We're really glad to see that, other people are stepping up and doing things, that businesses are doing things for them. And so my overwhelming, I guess what I see in the area, especially where I'm at, where I run my business, where I live, I see overwhelming support for law enforcement. Obviously, it's easy for the media to just highlight the instances where you're seeing a lot of negative views towards law enforcement. And of course, that's a little more exciting, I think, for everyone that's in the media. It's more exciting for ratings. It really seems to not be something, we'll say positive situations seem to be something that they just don't attract as much attention. And I think that's really unfortunate, because where I'm at, the people that I interact with on a daily basis, they are very much law enforcement supporters. They support the military. They're very patriotic. They love the United States. And it's just unfortunate that I feel, a lot of things are being tainted by the media, and a lot of influential young people that are seeing, gloom and doom, and officers need to be defunded, and, they're overstepping their boundaries. They're stomping on our Constitution, yada, yada, yada. The funny thing about Constitution is I love when I see people play it both ways. You have people that they all of a sudden now they want to step up and say, hey, you need to defund the police. They're stomping on my constitutional rights, yada, yada, yada. And the funny thing about that to me is, do these people not understand that the officer has a right to ask you questions? Now, maybe walking up on the street, and I'm not big on officers for no reason walking up on the street to someone, asking them for their ID, or just walking around randomly doing ID checks on people. I don't agree with that. But in a lot of the situations that we see highlighted, the officer starts with very basic questioning. It's very rational questioning, things that you would think were very logical. And it just looks like, at least the ones that they're broadcasting a lot in the media, that, just the sense of an officer's asking me a question. I was told that this is stomping on my Constitution, and therefore I do not need to cooperate with this officer whatsoever. And so it's like they use the Constitution when it's convenient, but then they don't want to use the other side of it, when it's something that could potentially work against them.
Well, I'm sure you're pretty flexible, but before you move on, you should reach your right hand up, bend your elbow, and pat yourself on the back. Because these days, as a business owner, to say you support law enforcement can be a kiss of death. We've seen 2 or 3 places that have lost their businesses that they've had to shut down. And it's really interesting when I hear people talking about law enforcement officers trampling on their civil rights. No one is trampling civil rights more in the United States right now than people who are rioting and burning down buildings. They're doing it en masse. They are preventing lawful citizens, law-abiding people, from walking around and taking their kids to go buy ice cream because they're afraid to go downtown. Absolutely. There is no more danger to your constitutional rights than these groups that are rioting and burning cities down.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we had a comment. I'm sorry, I couldn't even interrupt you there. We had a comment a couple of weeks ago from one of the viewers, and I thought it was really unique that he pointed out that freedom has rules and chaos does not. And I think a lot of people are confused when it comes to that. They view freedom as a free-for-all instead of, an organized, structured society. Well,
there was somebody posted some that was great, that they said there will be no order until there's justice. It's like, well, like I said, I think your grandma thinks you're intelligent, but nobody else does. You can't have justice you can't have it in that order. You can't say that there's going to be a way to peacefully live in society with total disorder. You're not going to riot your way to a civilized society. It never works.
No, absolutely not. And that's, speaking of our viewers and questions, we have Jason said, Chaz was a perfect example of lawlessness and people died. Atlanta allowing lawlessness and the 8-year-old girl dies. It doesn't work. Lawlessness doesn't work. Those same people at the Burger King in Atlanta were creating checkpoints and putting up barricades and stopping people's movement unlawfully, which is a whole nother issue with a crime taking place there. But it has shown over and over again it doesn't work. A man lost his son up in the Chaz area, and he was beyond thankful or beyond wanting the police there more than anything in the world. He wished law enforcement was there. And it's unfortunate, I think, for people to have to die to actually see that this stuff doesn't work. It just doesn't.
Well, the stuff that happened in Chaz was, I guess you could call it an experiment.
Sure.
And it kind of went off the same way experiments of single men go off when you leave food in the fridge for 7 months. It spoiled pretty quickly. I thought the first thing they did was build a wall and tell people you can't come in unless we let you. I thought that was quite entertaining for a free society. And there was also a pastor that went in there to minister people, and they choked him out and threw him out. So that kind of tells you who you were dealing with. I fail to see how it is expressing yourself and your constitutional rights, kind of to James's point, by destroying the constitutional rights to other people who might want to go see a war memorial or might want to go see a law enforcement memorial or just take their kids downtown to walk.
That's right. Another one of the listeners on my personal page even brought up something. He said, in his opinion, what would stop a lot of the respect issues is starting at home with discipline. We'll leave it. I won't say exactly what he said, but yeah, whoopings at home would probably help start that. So it's just one of those things where James and I have talked about before. It's kind of a societal breakdown, and you see that with certain groups. Again, we'll leave them nameless because, like you said, it gives them too much credit. Trying to change the family core structure in this country and trying to change the absolute core values of what we believe as Americans. And
well, I can tell you,
Marxist.
One of the funniest things that I've seen in that regard is it was actually posted by a teacher and said, "Your kids are at home. You didn't plan to homeschool. Now you know why we have problems with them." And I thought that was just absolutely hilarious because I talked to a couple of people who said, I love my kids, but not 24 hours a day. It's a handful. Yeah. But, and we do forget that, teachers, their responsibility is not just to keep the kids safe, but not just to educate them to get past the next standardized test, but to kind of let them know what their role is as a citizen. And, people have said, well, everybody, going from the Pledge of Allegiance to, government indoctrination. It's like, no, it's just teach them how to be a civil human being to other human beings. And that includes, if I disagree with you, I don't have to hate you.
Yep.
I don't know why that has gotten lost. And quite frankly, I was telling somebody the other day, I think it started with political correctness, where, you can't speak something if it's not politically correct. And I was going to Kennesaw State. I was getting a master's at the time. And somebody wanted me to sign a pamphlet or a ballot to get a political correctness ordinance on campus or a rule on campus. And I was sitting there with a guy who was in the military reserves. And I said, I'm not interested in that. And they said, well, what do you mean? I said, I went to a Methodist university where a professor taught a lecture that God is dead. And when people called for his resignation and termination, the university basically said, if free speech is dead on American campuses, then it doesn't exist anymore in the United States. And look how far we've come from that. That was during the time of the Clinton administration. We've now gotten to a point where if you say something that people don't agree with, if you fly, for instance, a blue line flag, then we're going to come after you, hate you, burn the flag, and call for your resignation. As for instance, in this one situation, as a police chief. And it's okay to disagree with people. I have friends that I disagree with completely. And I know this is shocking to Eric. Eric's known me a long time. There may actually be people who disagree with me. And that's okay, because I like to hear their viewpoints when they do. That's what's missing, is encouraging dissension without hating people.
Absolutely. Well, it's funny you say that, because my pastor at my church up here in Canton actually gave a sermon on this a couple of weeks ago, talking about how living in echo chambers is extremely dangerous, and only being around people that agree with you all the time is extremely dangerous, and it breeds divisiveness in our country and divisiveness in our communities. Instead of sitting down or being willing to hear out the people who have opposing viewpoints from you, one of my best friends in the world, he and I argue constantly over the phone, text messages, phone conversations, because we have very opposite viewpoints. but he's been able to at least let me see some of his viewpoints and where he's coming from. And he said, I've absolutely changed his view on several topics because I'm able to express things to him and make valid points about why I feel the way I feel. And just kind of James jump in behind me on that one.
Yeah, well, what I was going to say a moment ago was, I talk to people that, and I think it's a very unique view that they have on, and at least a conversation topic that sometimes they have about, well, if I fly, and this is what Lance said a moment ago, if I fly the blue line flag, or if I say that I, stand and support law enforcement, the very same people that I'm talking to a lot of times that are in opposition to that, or maybe the defund the police movement or whatnot, quite often they will be the first to say right along with you that, well, no, I don't believe that all law enforcement is bad. I think that most law enforcement officers are generally, pretty good people, and they're just trying to do their job. But as soon as I say that I support, or I back the blue, or I support law enforcement, I seem to be associated with only the bad players in law enforcement. And you can't have it both ways. And this goes back to what Lance mentioned a moment ago with, civil rights being stomped on. You can't have it both ways. You can't stand there and smack a law officer in the face and spit on him and then tell him that he's stomping on your civil rights. To me, it's just such a laughable topic. And it's, I'm quite amazed at how frequently this comes up when you do try to have some kind of debate with someone that maybe doesn't have the exact same viewpoints. And I'm like Lance, I'm all for hearing other viewpoints, but I also do sometimes, and maybe this is a flaw of mine, I also do, I'm somewhat skeptical when I'm listening to it, because I do tend to pick out the contradictions in it and the hypocrisy sometimes in what people say. So, getting back to, what I first said, when these people always want to associate me with the bad law enforcement, if you completely understand that and you believe that 90% of law enforcement are good people, then, and I say I like, law enforcement, or I support law enforcement, then just give me the benefit of the doubt that I'm probably agreeing with you that I like good law enforcement. And then, that leads us into a whole nother topic about having to put labels in front of everything you do, right? Well, I can't say I like law enforcement. I have to say I like good law enforcement. I think it should go without that.
And you shouldn't have to, because any sentient human being would know that what you're talking about. But, and the book, one of the books I wrote, Blue News, and the profit from that, and Peacemaking, which is about a cop's walk with Christ, and When Cops Kill, which is about officer-involved shootings. All the profits from those go to law enforcement charities. So to date, we've donated about $30,000. But Blue News is about the intersection of law enforcement and media, and it stemmed from encouraging law enforcement to get their message out. Because if you don't tell your story, someone else will. So when you're going through this analysis and you're looking at why these things get crazy and why you say you support law enforcement and people say, you mean this guy? Well, this has been happening for years. It's the same reason that people associate everyone who owns a firearm with the last crackpot who went and shot up a shopping mall. It's more of the political correctness. It's more of the agenda to try to suppress people's right to free speech by peer pressure. And whatever reason you do it, it's all a matter of not accepting a divergent viewpoint. It happens. And it's everything from, we can all look at, the actions of an officer and say, well, I wonder if they had to do things that way. I wonder if they had to use that much force. But to start with a premise that, wow, the force looked bad, let me help everybody listening to this. Lawful, morally justified, ethically justified, professionally applied use of force will never look good on video, ever.
Yep.
If James is teaching someone how to do a leg sweep in his studio and the person falls on their back or their side, gravity, exerts the same amount of force on everybody. It's never going to look pretty. So stop saying, well, it just looks bad. Well, of course it looks bad.
Amen to that, Lance. When I was in law enforcement, I had a citizens review board. They questioned one of my incidents without making a long story of it. The guy had to be struck several times, which you couldn't see really off camera, is that he was trying to grab a box cutter, and I was having to punch the man in the face and then put him in a chokehold. But the alternatives at that point, because he was trying to grab a box cutter, would be lethal force, which none of us want to do that. But that was kind of my response to them. They're like, well, it didn't look good. I was like, I understand that. And exactly what you said. No use of force looks good. It's not fun. Yes, the man was bleeding. Yes, I punched him in his face. But the alternative was death. And when I said that, my deputy chief at the time was like, very good points. I'll pass that on to him. So,
yeah. And you know, from not having a chain of command, I tend to send things like, you know what looks really bad as an officer with the side of his face cut open with a box cutter.
Yep. Yeah. Go ahead, James.
No, Lance used the word moral a while ago, and I mean,
sorry.
No, it's really good because we could do an entire podcast for hours on just that word that seems to be removed from everything we do. It seems to be removed from legislation. It seems to be removed from the household. It's removed from our interaction with law enforcement and whatnot. And if you don't have some kind of moral or values basis to start something with, you really can't have a conversation with anyone about anything. If it's easy for me to always say, well, to try to present a stance where law enforcement, has their hands tied to a certain degree, they don't know what's, who you are. They don't know what your intentions are. And then, the other guy just says, well, you know what? I just don't like law enforcement. You can't have a debate like that if there's no value or no moral basis that starts it off. And I think that's what we're seeing a lot today is the lack of that word itself, just moral.
Well, and I'll throw something else on it. Put an ITY at the end. You talk about morality. I will tell you that I have met more law enforcement officers who were youth pastors and people who work with kids who are underprivileged and foster parents and all of those different types of groups. I've met more of those folks in the profession of law enforcement than any other.
Yep, same experience with me. I mean, you see it, lots of baseball coaches, football coaches, things like that. One of my good friends, he's the chief probation officer now. I believe he's in Cobb County now. He was in Paulding, and he's a huge football coach, highly involved in the community, and that's what you constantly see. To hop on the point real quick, and we'll move on to the next topic. Christina Lamb happens to be my cousin. She said the girl that tweeted out about her dad dying used the hashtag Blue Lives Matter hashtag and was completely berated for using it, even though she was grieving her father, who was a police officer and obviously now dead. You can't have a difference of opinion anymore without having people freak out. I saw it. I don't know if you saw any of those tweets, Lance, or went back and looked. It was nauseating to me to see people saying the things they were saying to her about her murdered dad. It was disgusting.
We've seen that, though. There's actually an interview with a woman. I'm trying to remember what city it was in. I want to say it was either Detroit or Chicago. It's a pretty big inner city. And they approached a woman who's, I think her nephew had shot and killed a police officer. And she said, so what, he shot a cop?
Wow.
I mean, those sentiments have been around a long time. But, when you start jumping on a girl who just lost her dad and saying things like he deserved it, or who cares, it's just another one who's dead, that's not our society. No. Those are people who distinguish themselves and don't want to be part of a society. As much as they may scream and holler about it, I will guarantee you nobody wants to live in a completely amoral society because most people wouldn't live long in that environment.
No, and that is what else we talked about those very things with all the civil unrest and stuff like that. Yeah, most people aren't prepared to live more than a week without, a supply chain or something being interrupted.
I'm just drive-throughs closed, they'd be dead in 24 hours.
Yep.
Yeah. I'm thinking hours. There's a lot of people I see on a daily basis, and I wouldn't give them 6 or 8 hours.
No. So let's hop on to the next topic or question I guess I have for you, Lance. Said great on that one. Let's talk about one of the big things you hear about all the time with the public, and we covered it to a point on our podcast, is why didn't the police officer do this? Why didn't the police officer do that? Why? We covered an entire hour and a half on why police officers don't shoot people in the leg. So can you kind of go over for us the reality behind a use of force encounter and the science and the actual facts of what happens during one with your expert, not even opinion at this point, your expert research, I would say.
Sure. So a couple of different things about that. Let's start first of all with the fact that a use of force interaction is a physical interaction between two people. And just as an example, folks do not understand how fast those reactions take place. So an officer shooting or a person shooting at the officer, believe it or not, there's no difference in the speed. Excuse me. It takes about 0.25 seconds for a person to pull a trigger. So we sit and say, wow, the officer fired so many times. Why did they have to shoot so many times? Well, let's just talk about that to begin with. It takes time to start action, and it takes time to stop action. So a person sees a stimulus that indicates to them they need to take an action. Let's take a tennis player getting a ball served at them at 100 miles an hour, certainly not one of my tennis serves, but a ball coming at them at 100 miles an hour. They are on a tennis court, and they know they're going to take that oblong racket in their hand, and they are going to hit that tennis ball. They're waiting for the stimulus. They hear the noise at the same time they see, because they're pretty close, and the ball is coming towards them. They have to determine the track of the ball. They have to determine where the ball is going. Then they have to wind up with the racket, step into it, and then make contact. Law enforcement interactions are no different. So you see a person with their hand on their waistband with a gun in their hand. The officer has the gun at their low ready, thinking they may have to use deadly force. Action will always beat reaction. So a person with the gun in their waistband can draw and fire a shot in an average, so some higher, some lower, of 0.26 seconds. Now, to give you an idea of how fast that is, a fast blink by a sniper trying to keep their eye wet, because dry eyes don't do well. So a fast blink is 0.18 seconds. So 0.26 seconds for the person to fire one shot. An officer with their gun ready, looking for that stimulus and waiting for the stimulus to raise their gun and fire, will take 0.83 seconds to fire the first shot. So now let's go back to the other side where the person has the gun in their hands, their waistband, and they're going to draw it. We already know that it's 0.25 seconds per shot. I'm a litigator, so all I can do is divide by 3. We do a lot of personal injury cases and tractor trailer wrecks. So this is the only math you're going to see me do. 0.26 seconds for the first shot, 0.25 for the second, 0.25 for the third. That's 0.76 seconds. The suspect has shot 3 times before the officer can fire once.
Right.
Now, let's extrapolate that back to how officers deal with suspects. If we already know that we're behind the curve, that we are going to lose that encounter because we are going to get shot, we have to take proactive measures, such as standing behind our car door, such as telling people, sir, don't put your hands in your pockets. Keep your hands out of your pockets, because we're trying to keep that reactionary gap from mowing us over in a deadly force interaction. In addition, a person who uses force, let's say a person fires one shot and turns. A person can turn 90 degrees in less than 0.25 seconds. So if I see that stimulus where the person has shot at me and I raise my gun to shoot, in the time it takes me to pull the trigger, their back will be turned to me. Absolutely. Even though at the time I started pulling the trigger and committed to pulling the trigger, they were facing me. Now, here's what's important. It takes time to stop that action too. So when the officer sees the stimulus that justifies the use of force and they fire 3 or 4 shots, which they're trained to shoot until the threat is over, those shots are piling up and that person is turning and now turned. Those shots hit them in the back and the officer stops. And here's a real world example people can get. It is a violation of the rules in football for somebody who's approximately the size of a Buick to mow over a quarterback who doesn't have a ball in their hand. Everybody understands that. But we see professional athletes, the best in the world, unbelievable reflexes, running towards a quarterback. They get through the front line and they're running. And they're looking for that stimulus for the quarterback to have the ball. And they are committed to how they're going to take that quarterback down. They're either going to wrap their arms around him, they're going to get their legs, they're going to knock him over, they're going to do whatever they can to take that quarterback down, interrupt the pass, and or tackle them. The quarterback releases the ball. It is completely out of their fingers. And what does that professional athlete do? They hit the quarterback anyway.
Yep. And I think that's just something a lot of people don't understand, is how quickly those situations happen, kind of like what the reflexes and things are going on. There's been plenty of those incidents. We actually did a training class on that very topic when I was in law enforcement. It was one of my old lieutenants. He was like speaking about action versus reaction, and we had sim guns. And he said, okay, I'm going to have my back to you. I'm going to have a gun in my hand. And he's like, I want you to shoot me before I shoot you once you feel it's justified when I start turning towards you. Never once, and I'm a pretty good shot, and at the time I was very young, so I had very good reflexes, and he was probably 20 years my senior at that point. He hit me every single time before I could get a shot off. And
well, I'll give you an example we'll do right now. I've done some expert use of force cases, but I'm going to give you an example right now. If I have my hands, they're about shoulder width apart right now. Okay, let me move here. There we go. All right, so you guys put your hands about shoulder width apart, and when I clap, you clap. All right? Now, you guys know what I want you to do. Everybody's clear, right?
Yep.
Okay, you ready?
Yep.
I can put my hands twice as far, and you can put your hands this far apart. I'll beat you every time. Action is faster than reaction. Now, it's a little delayed because of the video,
Sure.
But I can assure you that is exactly why law enforcement officers are constantly trying to take what we call tactical control over a situation. That's why they say to people, please step out of the car. In most states, you have to for DUI detection. That's why they stay behind the B post in the cars, because somebody reaches out with a gun, they have an opportunity to react. That's why they say to somebody, sir, please don't reach in your car because you're making me nervous. Now, let's go back on the other side of this equation with the numbnuts that scream and holler about police. And as James said, you're violating my constitutional rights. It's not violating your constitutional rights to ask you not to reach around in your car when you're on a traffic stop. That's asking you to be a responsible citizen, because law enforcement officers have been shot on traffic stops by people of unknown dangers when they stop them for running a stop sign. Now, does that mean you are going to shoot an officer? No, but it means that you should recognize there's a risk. It means you should recognize that if you reach around inside the car, you're going to make a reasonable officer nervous. So therefore, you don't reach around inside your car. You may have a right to do it, but it doesn't mean it's smart. You have a right to walk around the mall in your underwear. But when you do, people are going to stare at you.
Absolutely. And I think a good video, and I know you've seen this video before too, Lance, about somebody that seems completely non-threat. The vehicle stop was for a seatbelt violation. It was in Texas. It was an older gentleman. I believe he's late 70s, early 80s. And he had a carbine in his car. And in his mind, he was going to shoot the next police officer that pulled him over about a seatbelt being off. And he ended up killing a police officer simply over a seatbelt. And that's literally all that the guy shot the police officer for. And the officer died, unfortunately, and was murdered. But that's the biggest thing I always try to get across to people when I was in law enforcement is, look, I don't know you from Adam. I don't know who you are. I don't know what your intentions are. You might be the greatest person I've ever met in my life, but until we can have a dialogue, a simple dialogue, and talk about it, I have no way of knowing that.
Well, another real world example of that.
Go ahead, James.
Go ahead.
No, and it kind of gets back to what James said before. You know, could I sit here for 3 hours and tell you of all the stories of law enforcement officers who were shot and killed or overpowered and disarmed by people who seemed like they were not a threat at all? Yep. Unfortunately, I can, because it happens every day in the United States where officers are assaulted. And unfortunately, it happens way too often where they're killed. But when you start examining those situations and going back, we also know that time after time after time, those situations that become deadly are prevented because the officer takes control. And I'll give you an example. A very good friend of mine, when I was working for Cobb County Police, stopped a car. Car was speeding. The person that he stopped was polite. He was decent to the officer. He said he couldn't find his driver's license. The officer goes back and runs him. Now, people say, why are you running me? I'm not a bad guy. Well, the officer goes back and runs him. And it comes back that the car is wanted. It was used in a carjacking. The individual involved in the carjacking on the left side of his head had a scar that started above his hairline. If I had a hairline, you'd see this, and went all the way down to his cheek. Well, the officer realized he now has an armed robbery and carjacking suspect stopped. The only way we survived that incident, and the only way the suspects, there were two of them in the car. Remember, one officer, two suspects. The only way the suspects survived and they were handcuffed and taken to jail is by an unbelievable amount of control by the officers. I responded. We pointed guns at them. We told them in no uncertain terms, we are taking you into custody. You are under arrest. You will follow our orders, and this will go very smoothly. And the example that people give all the time, well, you can't tell me to lay on the ground. Well, you're right. Maybe I can't. The bottom line is I have to if I want to stay alive, because my goal is to take you in custody without incident, without using any force, and take you before a judge.
Sure. Yeah. Go ahead, James.
No, I was going to say earlier, and it's these common examples that come up every day would be something as simple as pedestrian crosswalk, right? You can, sure, you have the right of way if you're a pedestrian in a crosswalk, but that doesn't mean to step out in front of a MARTA bus as it's getting to the crosswalk. And, a lot of people put themselves in this danger unnecessarily. I've just always found it, well, I've grown up a lot, we'll say, in the last 20 years of my life. And since then, I've just always found that, why are you looking for some kind of adverse interaction with anyone? If I have a customer walk in the door, I want to make them feel comfortable. I would rather have a very positive experience with this person than to have a negative experience. And, just by the simple fact that in someone's head, they think that their day got impeded, or that, oh, he stopped me unnecessarily. And again, Lance pointed out earlier, you don't always know what they may either have been told that they're looking for, or you may fit the description of, things like that. And if you're always thinking like, wow, he inconvenienced me, I think I'm going to be an asshole and be as harsh as I can to this guy for no reason whatsoever, you're obviously asking for trouble, and you're not going to have a smooth interaction at that point.
Well, and it's not just that. Why do that? On Facebook the other day, somebody told me that they went to a protest and their son was screaming at a police officer, and the police officer was rude to them. And my question was, why was your son screaming at a police officer? For that matter, why is your adult son screaming at anybody? And it's, people don't like being told what to do. We understand that, but kind of getting back to that order in society, there's certain things that you have to do in order to live there. So I'll give you an example. I live in a decent neighborhood. When I say this, you're going to wonder, but somebody shot at some police up in my neighborhood. They got into a car chase and they shot at the police, and they took that extremely personally and called all their friends to help find this person, because they recognized if they would shoot at a law enforcement officer, then they would take anybody else's life. Well, cue about an hour later, I go to let my dogs out at about 4:00 in the morning, and I live on a pretty big piece of property. And I let my dogs out in the morning, and I see 5 flashlights come on from the front trees. Now, these are not the flashlights that I used to carry that look like Paul Revere's lantern. These were flashlights that would blister your skin from 100 yards, okay? They said, show me your hands. Now, I'm on my front porch. Did I say, hey, this is my house, go away? Did I say, hey, I'm a retired police officer? Did I say, hey, I'm the general counsel for the Georgia Fraternal Order of Police? No, let me guess what I did. I put my hands up because I didn't want to get shot. Because at that point, I had no idea what they were looking for. I knew that somebody had been around there and there'd been some problems and the police were around. But at that point, I just put my hands up. And, the officer, you talk about thinking under stress, the officer, I'll never forget, I see him occasionally. He asked a question that was absolutely brilliant. He said, what's the address here? Because a true bad guy would not have known that. And then when I told him, and he was satisfied who I was, he came up from behind the tree and explained what was going on. But I know behind all of those flashlights, there were firearms, and I expected there to be. Not, well, you disrespected me by asking me to do something. It's part of your obligation as a citizen. Live up to it. And the vast majority of people do.
Did you explain to him that you would be representing him later on? Had he done something else?
Yeah, well, it was kind of funny. He got a big kick out of it. And actually, funny story, his recruit saw me with him. They were eating lunch and they saw me, and the recruit started apologizing. And I said, just time out. Do not apologize for doing your job. Because in that situation, when I came out, I'm a completely unknown risk. And I'll tell you, the person who had shot at them was a white male, 5'11", 200 pounds with brown hair. Look like anybody you know?
Sounds vaguely familiar.
And he's running around that area. How many other people are out at 4 a.m? I just happened to get up early. I said, you did the exact right thing. And had you been wrong and let your guard down, I would have gotten the first shot.
Sure. And that actually brings me to something I wanted to ask you about, and I want to say what Jason brought up, and I agree with him wholeheartedly. He said he was taught by his grandfather, who's highway patrol and later a sheriff. If you're pulled over, turn the ignition off, place the keys on the dash, keep your hands steering wheel where the officer makes contact with me. Also, never argue a police officer no matter the situation. That's what courts are for. You were taught right, 100%, as I think we talked about previously, James. Pretty much anytime somebody gave me an interaction like that, it would usually ended very pleasantly. If it was a traffic stop, a lot of times they'd go away with a warning simply because they were so nice to me and made it a point to disarm me or disarm the situation where I wasn't, on edge or worried. So that's absolutely the right thing to do. To kind of get to your point, Lance, about what you were saying, what can you tell me about the statement that I've seen so much lately where people were like, well, they signed up for the job. It was expected for them to get shot at, expected for them to get spit on, expected for them to get poop thrown at them, pee thrown at them, berated, cursed out, and just demeaned. Yes, that's it.
Nobody could expect that. Nobody should accept that, whether they're wearing uniform or not. And let me go back before to one of the things that you said. People talk about, well, I did that. I read this story about this guy who was polite to the officer and he kept his hands where he could, and officers shoot unarmed people every day. Well, first of all, that's not true. That's a falsehood. Law enforcement officers shoot and kill less than 1,000 people a year. About 4% of those people are unarmed, but we have to look at the spin on unarmed. In those statistics, and there was a study done in 2015 of study of shootings by the New York Post about police shootings. And they said 4% of the people were unarmed. Well, you have to use that in the light of political correctness. Unarmed meant no gun. So when you go deeper into the situation, you have, in one of those situations, a person was armed with some sort of a shovel or a rake or other garden implement. And I can assure you, if I'm in uniform and you swing a shovel at me, I'm going to shoot you, because that's an aggravated assault and you can kill me with it. Now, getting back to what the police should put up with and shouldn't put up with, it's a really interesting thing when people say, well, when you stand there on guard duty, and we've seen these videos of people blowing smoke in National Guardsmen's faces and streaming and cursing at people and trying to see how you can stoke them up. There's no purpose in that. The only purpose in that is trying to evoke anarchy, and that doesn't benefit anyone.
100%. And to kind of bring along more the science of it, you see where the media and the public is wanting a immediate response, an immediate interview with the officer. They want the facts of the shooting out the next day. And again, for personal experience, why is it that police officers that are involved in the shootings wait to make statements, why they don't make statements on scene? And can you kind of get into the science and the studies behind that to maybe educate the people that don't know and haven't been through it of why that is something law enforcement practices?
Sure. First of all, you have two choices when you have an officer-involved shooting. You can have quick answers, or you can have a thorough investigation. You can't have both. You're never going to have both.
Right.
So when we look at a situation where an officer uses force, and I'll use a primary example, people want the officer fired immediately. The dumbest thing you could do, if you believe in police reform, is call for an officer to be fired immediately. There's a case out of the United States Supreme Court called Garrity versus New Jersey. It's a very unique situation where law enforcement agencies can force their officers to answer questions under threat of termination. So if you have a training issue, if you have a selection issue, if you're hiring bad people, if you have a culture issue and you are trying to route it out and fix it, the best thing you can do is leave that officer in place and force them to tell you what's going on and what happened. And firing them immediately deprives the agency of the ability to do that. Now, after the situation, it's been proven, it's a concept called fragmented memory, that there are situations that when human beings, and I'll give you a real world example, when human beings get into a sensory overload situation, their bodies record, their brains record a tremendous amount of information, but they may not be able to recall it. So anyone who is driven on the Stephen King Expressway, the 285, understands that you could be driving and you move to avoid a wreck, you hit the brakes, you swerve, and what's the next thought that they have in your brain? Where did that car come from? That's a very mild example of what we see in officer-involved shootings. We see situations that are extremely high speed, where a great deal of stimulus is coming at the officer. Now, let's look at that in the concept of human performance. When we know that there is a threat we are perceiving, our eyes look for threats constantly. Our eyes focus on threats. And if the threat is significant enough, we focus on that threat to the exclusion of everything else. And we saw this situation. There's a video you can see out. I think it was Philadelphia or Chicago. 2 officers go in to answer a call of a man supposedly armed with a gun and threatening people. They're talking to him. They're trying to move out so he can't, if he does have a gun, shoot both of them at the same time. And eventually he pulls the gun out and both of them shoot him. And they are asked a question, what did the mother say? Well, there's a concept that happens. It's called tunnel vision, where during this situation, you're looking through a tube about like this, but also auditory exclusion. Neither one of those officers remembered the mother being 8 or 10 feet away from the suspect because they were so focused on an armed person who was threatening people. That is part of human nature. That's one of the reasons why we look a body camera video and say, well, we can see what the officer saw. A body camera will never give you the officer's perspective. Body cameras have no peripheral vision. They use fisheye lenses to give you as much view as possible. That means they distort distance. Just like when you've rented a hotel room at a resort and you're like, you know, honey, it looked a lot bigger on the internet than it does now that we're here. That's a fisheye lens. So when we're looking at the situation from the officer's perspective, first of all, that camera is not sitting on top of your eye, and that camera does not have the physiological response of focusing on the threat to the exclusion of everything else. So when we're debriefing an officer, when we're asking them what happened, we know the officer has brought to that situation all of their training, all their experience, and all of their personal real life experience separate and apart from being an officer. So I'll give you an example of an officer who winds up having to shoot a woman who is a threat on a domestic dispute. Woman's armed with a knife, and the officer repeatedly gives commands to drop the knife, and winds up having to lawfully use force against a woman. Now, we can talk about whether what I said is sexist or what. It's not. We have in our minds a role of females being less aggressive than men. So one of the things that the officer will have to wrap their head around is that the bad guy, they always prepared themselves to maybe have to use deadly force against, actually wound up being a female. And I have seen officers permanently disabled by the emotional response they had to being forced to use deadly force. So there's plenty of research that it takes a couple of sleep cycles for that officer to decompress to their physiological standard prior, so they can relate what happened and put that information back in play. Now, it goes even further. So a group called Force Science, it's FORCE Science, has been studying law enforcement and use of force interactions for years. The person who runs it is a better than half a century martial artist. So he's been very into how people interact and in violent physical confrontations. In one situation, you know how people talk about cops in England not having guns?
Yep.
Okay, well, they were training cops in England who have guns, because that's a complete lie that cops in England don't carry guns. So they were training officers in England who are armed police officers, and they had body cameras on them. They also had a tremendous amount of video from around the scenario to see what was going on. These were very, very, very high-speed scenarios that required the officers to be put under extreme stress. So they went through the scenario, and then they sat down to debrief. And during the scenario, the officers were wearing monitors for their physiological response. When they sat them down and showed them the video, they're completely safe now, okay? They sat them down and showed them the video of them and their fellow officers going through that high-speed, remember, training scenario. their physiological response was almost exactly the same as perceiving the event. So it has a tremendous physical and mental and psychological effect on officers.
Okay, well, then we'll ask this question for Lance. Then at what point, if nowadays they seem to, call for the officer to be removed immediately, they're indicting them immediately with poor investigations, things like that, at what point does the officer have the same rights that the citizen has to not incriminate himself, not become a witness against himself? I mean, it's like you can't have it both ways, right? You can't go after the officer right away when it happens, and then at the same time expect that he's going to have any kind of constitutional protection at that point. And so, I mean, are the rules the same for the officer, where if he has the right to remain silent, how does that work?
Law enforcement officers have absolutely no obligation to speak to criminal investigators after a use of force incident. None.
Okay.
They have a Fifth Amendment right, because at that point, they are a subject in a criminal investigation. So they do not have to say anything. Now, typically they do, because they're trying to get across what happened and they're victims of crimes. But the officer has no obligation to speak to law enforcement investigators at all. So typically what happens is the officer will say, look, I'll speak to you, but I want to get some rest first. So I've represented officers who were at the end of a shift, at the end of a 5-day week, at the end of a double shift. And I can tell you, I've spoken to officers who are so fatigued after a situation. People ask me, well, what do you talk about with officers when you're in the room with them alone afterwards? Sometimes we pray. Sometimes I make sure that their spouse knows they're okay. And most of the time I have a hard time keeping them awake. All of us have been in physical confrontations. James, you've been in far more than I have. When you're in the knockdown, drag out, man, I can't believe how tough that physical confrontation was. And then you add severe fear on top of it, and the adrenaline leaves your system. What do you want to do? You want to sleep. That is not the time. That is not the time to give a statement that you, your agency, your family, and the public is going to rely on to know what happened. And, we see this, well, we don't give armed robbers 2 days worth of sleep before we interview them. Well, let's dispel that now. When I talk about this in When Cops Kill, I think it's chapter 6, we just go through why delayed interviews are not a problem with law enforcement. There's plenty of research about officers giving more coherent statements after a couple of sleep cycles. You have a bad guy who robs we used to kid around and call them stop and rob. So a convenience store. They rob the convenience store. We don't know who they are. We don't know who their accomplices are. We've got to find out information. We don't know why they did. They addicted to drugs? Did they want money? Is this part of a bigger scheme? When an officer is involved in a situation, we know who they came to work with. We have a complete background packet on who they are. And as I would say, I don't know how broad your reach is, but we know who their mamas are. There's no reason to rush to get a statement from this person. They're not going anywhere. So there's just this misconception about what happens after the use of force. And going back to what I said to start with, do you want a thorough investigation or do you want quick answers? The biggest example that I'll give you, that hopefully this will stick with people, in a great investigation with some fantastic homicide investigators with one of the best crime labs you could imagine, it'll take 6 to 8 weeks to get toxicology reports back. So if we have an officer who gets involved in a deadly force situation with somebody who is overpowering them or hitting them with a blunt object to the point where the officer uses deadly force, isn't that something we want to know, whether the person had PCP or illegal drugs in their system? Of course it is. You're not going to know that for 6 to 8 weeks.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Lance. Oops, messed up that. So you're absolutely right with that.
Y'all are surrounding me. That's what you're doing.
I know. We just wanted to change it up, I guess, a little bit. I don't know what happened there. Oh, I've got it. But it makes such a huge difference, again, going through my thing that I went through without getting into too many specifics, I didn't know how many times I had shot without looking at the magazine in my gun. So assuming that everything was the way it was supposed to be within policy and all that other stuff, I knew how many rounds I shot in theory, of course. But, like we talked about, I wasn't going to say anything because I didn't know for sure, I couldn't tell you how many times I did. And, going back to the auditory exclusion from an officer that's been through it, one thing you told me about, the aftermath with me was, I told you I didn't hear the shots, none of that stuff. And you said, wait till you go to qualify the first time when you go back from your shooting. He's like, you're going to be so nervous the first time you feel the concussion from the gun. And I was like, no, I shoot in the high 90s all the time, Lance. I'll be great. I got this. I can 1,000% say, and thank goodness we started from the 3 in our qualification, not back at the 25. Otherwise, I probably would have missed the paper completely. Yeah, the first time I felt the concussion from that gun and felt the reverberation from it, I could literally almost see my heart beating through my chest, and I had a vest on. Just because of the effects that people don't realize, like you said, the general public, unless they've been through it, thankfully they don't have to go through it on a daily basis. They don't realize the long-lasting effects and short-term effects it has on guys and girls.
July 10th of 1990, I answered a call where a guy was holding a 3-year-old hostage at knife point. He had a butcher knife up to his throat and had the kid on his lap. I came close to shooting him. Fortunately, and I thank God every day I didn't have to, but I got about halfway through the trigger pull of I'm old, so a revolver. These things they used to carry called revolvers. I didn't sleep well for 6 months.
Sure.
And I didn't even take a life. So
Yep.
it has a tremendous effect on officers. It changes the way they operate. And we've had people that don't understand, why did the officer shoot so many times? Well, how did they shoot that quickly? They must be a trained killer. If you watch the iconic video of the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan, John Hinckley Jr. had 0 firearms instruction. He shot 6 shots in 1.1 seconds and hit 4 people, including the most protected person on the planet. Well, now let's go back to an officer who is trained very well and trained that when they get that stimulus, they will use deadly force to protect themselves, a third person, or to stop a forcible felony until the threat is gone. Why would you expect them to shoot slower than John Hinckley Jr.?
James?
Yeah, no, and he's absolutely right. And to kind of follow up on what he said earlier, if the argument is going to be that for whatever reason, people don't want to see officers having time in between their interview, the criminals absolutely have this exact same right, whether they know it or not, or whether they choose to use it. I just know, a lot of criminals that I've seen before just didn't seem to understand the fact that they're trying to tell them to protect them from themselves. And maybe they didn't need to just go run off at the mouth and do interviews. I mean, they can always decline interviews and ask for their attorney, and they can keep their mouth shut and go into jail. So I really don't understand where that argument gets, a lot of traction from. When you're talking about an officer should give a statement right away. An officer may not have to give a statement at all in certain cases, and in some cases may not or probably shouldn't be expected to, just as a criminal has these exact same rights.
I have seen officers, I have seen combat veterans who have taken lives in the course of war break down completely after they were forced to use deadly force in a law enforcement context. So let me give you an example. In When Cops Kill, I interviewed a guy who was a law enforcement officer, retired as a cop, retired special forces, been there, done that, got all the T-shirts, disappeared to places, and you'd see it blowing up on the news, say, well, I guess we found him. And I asked him, what was more stressful, being a law enforcement officer or being a special forces soldier? And he didn't hesitate at all. He said, far and away, it's more stressful to be a law enforcement officer. And this is the example he used to me. Now, keep in mind, when he went to Afghanistan, he was one of the first groups in Afghanistan. He would start his day by sliding a tourniquet up on his right arm, because he was in the right seat of a Toyota 4Runner, and then he would slide a tourniquet up on the right leg, because you couldn't put it on with one hand, but you could pull it tight with one hand or with your teeth. That was how he started his day. And he said, if you look at 100% stress from 0 to 100%, when he was in a combat zone, he probably stayed at 40 to 60% all the time, and then moved up and down, sometimes to 100, sometimes down to 40, maybe sometimes down to 30, but he was always in a level of stress. He said, in law enforcement, you go into the convenience store you've been to 100 times, somebody's robbing it, or they take a shot at you, and you go from 0 stress to maximum stress in a microsecond. And this retired Special Forces soldier told me that nothing in the world could be more stressful than that. And if that doesn't sum it up for people about what happens when an officer goes through a deadly force encounter, that should do it.
Yeah, I agree 100%. It's one of the most stressful event I've ever had in my entire life, from start to finish, and obviously for days and weeks afterwards. It can absolutely cause all kinds of issues down the road. And I want to hit a couple comments real quick. We've got Gage that Lance is a great guest. Sharp, I would agree. You've been nominated for president, Lance. Preston Stover said,
"Don't you wish that on me?"
We'll expect to see him announcing his candidacy soon.
Yep. And then we've got Jason Cousins. He said, every time I fire any firearm, the concussion reminds me of an IED and an RPG all rolled into one event. Yeah, I absolutely can relate to you on that. I've never, been in an IED or RPG situation, but yeah, the concussion, yeah, I get it. It's mind blowing. You can shoot tens of thousands of rounds in your life, and it absolutely it's like the first time you ever picked up a weapon. I was so incredibly nervous.
There's another side of this too. The investigation itself is just, we always kid around with people in the police academy. What's the most stressful call you get? We ask on the first day, and it's like the domestic dispute, the bank robbery. No, it's actually report to the chief's office. So, it's stressful. And, we just finished a book that we put out called Firefighters in the Hot Seat. And it's about firefighters and OPS investigations, internal affairs investigations, all the profits. It's on Amazon, all the profits, or Lance LoRusso books.com. All the profits are going to go to firefighter charities. And I represent a lot of firefighters. And it's amazing the people who will put on protective gear and run into your house not knowing where your bedroom is as opposed to your bathroom or the closets, and go in there when the building's fully engulfed to save people they don't know, will be scared to death to show up to an OPS investigation. So we decided to write this book to kind of give them some guidance. And then we decided to donate thank you very much. And then to donate the profits to firefighter charities.
Outstanding. I can, again, we're going back to my personal experiences. You're absolutely right. That is one of the most stressful parts of your day is getting called into an office to be asked questions. You didn't do anything wrong, but it's just still the nerve-wracking thing. And then, the weeks and months that follow the investigation when you're waiting to be completely cleared by, the investigating agency, it's absolutely nerve-wracking. Which brings me to my next question for you. This is going to be kind of more specifically geared towards police officers. Why is it so important that a law enforcement officer or even a firefighter, somebody in public safety, obtain their own representation for incidents such as an officer-involved shooting or a critical incident type thing that requires an investigation?
All right. So despite all the jokes, lawyers have a lot of rules. And conflicts of interest are always the little landmines that you have in these situations. Lawyers are always trying to make sure that they're avoiding those conflicts, because conflicts get in the way of you giving your full fiduciary obligations to one individual. So a lot of people get involved in law enforcement and say, well, the city attorney or the county attorney can represent me if I get into a shooting. Well, they can't, because they have divided loyalties there. They're constantly looking out for their client, which is the city or the county. Now, I represent the Georgia Fraternal Order of Police. I'm licensed in Georgia and Tennessee and Arkansas, and I've been to Arkansas to defend an officer, a great guy who was really run through the mud after a lawful shooting. I have an office in Chattanooga. I have an office in Columbus, Georgia, an office in Atlanta. And the FOP has a legal defense plan that I think is second to none. It's an unlimited legal defense plan. People that are law enforcement can go to foplegal.com and look at it. They have paid as much as $1 million to defend officers before. And the people that are selected as attorneys in that group, we have training for them, and we also select to make sure that they know what they're doing. Yeah, there you go. We're honored. We have 2 other lawyers in my office that do this. I responded to a shooting Monday night. I responded to a shooting last week. It's just been an absolute crazy time. And I can tell you that when you're trying to decide what's going to happen in those minutes or hours after a situation, you don't want to be opening the phone book to try to find an attorney. Now, your brother-in-law may be a great guy. Your sister who practices real estate law may be the best real estate lawyer in the world. But when you're talking about hiring someone to defend you, but when James said, what are your rights? What are your constitutional rights? What are your due process rights? What are the rights you have under the department? Where are the alligators in that investigation? Are there going to be gaps that you can't fill in that need to be handled? Should you delay an interview? We had an officer who was involved in a shooting, and after the shooting, he was rushed to the ER because his blood pressure was 250 over 190. In that situation, he didn't need to be doing anything other than getting medical treatment. So we delayed his interview for about 30 days. This is what we do at my firm. Now, we do a lot of other stuff for police and firefighters and individuals. We represent them in car wrecks and tractor trailer wrecks and things like that. But, representing folks in these use of force incidents is near and dear to my heart. It's a very unique area of law. When you start talking about the interplay between what I talked about, Garrity versus New Jersey, and the Miranda warning, that in and of itself is something that I've taught classes that were 4 and 8 hours long to other lawyers and union presidents and individuals that were working on representing members, and to people in the academy. And I'm not talking about rookies. I'm talking about advanced command staff so they could learn more about their obligations to their officers.
Yep, it's I can say again, as going through it myself for my fellow law enforcement officers out there, having somebody on your side to go to Lance's point about the commercial or the real estate attorneys and all these other things you may have against somebody you do implicitly trust. Heck, it could be your wife or your husband, but having somebody that knows the steps and knows the process, as somebody that's been through it, it means the world to know what the next step is, what's going to happen. I'll never forget when I went in for my interview with the investigating agency, and I already knew what to expect, and at least put my mind at ease to where I could give a good, thorough, truthful statement and answer all their questions to the best of my ability, because I wasn't nervous. It took all the nerves out of it for me. So I would highly suggest anybody that is in law enforcement or public safety absolutely get the legal defense plan. As Patty said, you have to be a member of the Fraternal Order of Police to get the FOP defense plan. I believe that's still the case. GeorgiaFOP.org for Georgia. And, I highly recommend joining it. And James, I'll let you follow up.
Yeah. So I'm gonna move down to something you're posting on the screen here, and that's looks like a question for Lance here. Why have the officers involved in the Breonna Taylor's case not been charged? Do you think they should be, and why or why not? And this is a case that I've studied and looked into quite a bit. If you feel like you care to give some of your comments on that, that'd be great.
Well, I suspect that the reason they haven't been charged is the investigation's still going on. I can tell you all I know from that case is what I've seen in the media. And if you watch carefully, what you see in the media is conflicting. And, we mentioned the media earlier, and in Blue News, I talk to a lot of folks in the media, and I can tell you I've done probably close to 600 media interviews. The vast majority of people in the media are very, very good people. They're trained. They're good journalists. They want to do it right. The problem is they're under time deadlines. And I have a chart that I use when I teach between media investigations on an incident and law enforcement investigations. And one is time driven. The other one is driven by getting things right. One is driven by trying to make sure that the story stays alive because new information is pointed out. The other one is driven by going at whatever speed they need to and wherever the investigation goes. One is driven by getting something to put out there, whether it's voice or a quote or a face in front of a camera, where law enforcement is driven by vetting witnesses. So a lot of times, the bad stuff you see and that people blame the media for sometimes is just a function of, they're a profit-driven business and they're trying to, throw a dart at a board to try to find out what the public's interested in. And I can tell you it's very difficult sometimes for them to do so.
All right, I like it. You got Dee Nelson with a follow-up, one of our good friends. Lance, do you think there should be a national use of force database, and why? Would that help keep officers with repeated justified use of force complaints from going from agency to agency? What's your thoughts on that?
And it's interesting. We've seen databases used against officers in the way of Giglio lists. You have an officer who's involved in shootings. So I've represented officers who've been involved in multiple shootings. Does that mean the officer should be taken off the road? Does that mean they should be sidelined? And unfortunately, I worry about with these national use of force databases that's exactly what they'll be used to do. I got interviewed in a series of interviews. I got interviewed by this guy, and his first question was, how come more officers are not arrested after the use of force? And I said, well, that's because their training's good. And he said, well, what are you talking about? I said, we train officers in the academy when they can use force and when they can't. Then we take them out to the range to make sure they hit what they're aiming at. And then we retrain them every year in the law and the skills. So the goal should be that when they're placed under stress, they use force appropriately and according to the law. Not, well, we had 50 shootings in this jurisdiction, so now we have to put someone in jail. That doesn't make any sense. And
Right.
The example that I used for them, you take an officer in the most rural area that, the Mayberry of the United States, to the extent that it exists. The Mayberry of the United States, you take that officer and the officer is trained, they're certified, they've done everything they need to do, and then you put them in an inner city with a high crime area. They will probably use as much force as the officer who has worked in that high crime area for the past 20 years.
Yep.
And vice versa. You take that officer who's been involved in 3 shootings and you put them in that, laid back community, and they're not going to use force against anybody. And a lot of it has to do with the officer is always reacting to the suspect's actions. So we hear a lot about this term de-escalation. First of all, de-escalation is an outcome, not a tactic. So if I stop a guy who's 300 pounds and 6'8", and I said, sir, you need to calm down, and he says, I'm going to choke you out and put you in the trunk, I can de-escalate all I want. Mm-hmm. But if I don't do something to change that dynamic, I'm going to become really good friends with the spare tire pretty quickly, because I can't do anything to make him do right. As we have heard people say, make them do right. Well, if I could figure out how to do that, I'll bottle it and sell it at Kroger. So when we have an interaction, you have 2 individuals. If the suspect does not de-escalate, James kind of gets to what you're talking about. They refuse to cooperate. They refuse to show their hands. They refuse to stop putting their hands in their pockets, digging around inside the car. If they refuse to de-escalate their actions, there will be no de-escalation of the situation in general.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that's it's just as much, if not more, on the person having the contact with the police officer to de-escalate the situation as it is on the police officer. And James,
well, it absolutely is, Eric. If you look at the situation, law enforcement officers make 12 to 13 million custodial arrests a year.
Yep.
By estimates, they contact 6 to 10 people for every person they arrest. So 12 to 13 million custodial arrests, 10 to 12 million, depending on which stat you use. And you shoot and kill less than 1,000 people a year. Well, if you look at how many people they contact, it's about 66 to 110 million people a year have interactions with law enforcement. 12 million of those turn into arrests, and less than 1,000 people get shot by police and killed.
Yeah, well, I agree. Yeah. James, let's follow up, and I'm going to ask a follow-up question as well.
Yeah, no, and this goes back to I think the start of that last comment was based off of the question about the use of force database, and I would be extremely opposed to any kind of database where you don't have a number one, a very specific criteria that is going to log the data into the database, meaning every time I get a complaint for any kind of force or any use of force or whatnot, and especially if we're not talking about specifically deadly force, then I don't know who's inputting this into the system. I don't know how many complaints. I think Lance touched on it a little bit, and it would all depend on the location, geographical location, sometimes of where you're at, how many complaints there would be versus, maybe how many entries you would end up with in this database. And, I think people could be, inappropriately targeted for their jobs and have really bad outcomes just due to who do you really trust to create the database and who has access to the database.
Well, I'll give you an example. We have a national practitioner database. I defended doctors and hospitals for about 18 years. And the national practitioner database, if there's certain criteria, doctors get entered into that database. And one of them, I'll give you an example. They settle a claim over a certain threshold, and whatever that threshold is. I have seen that database destroy very good doctors' careers. And one example I'll give you, this guy worked in a jail setting. God love him from wanting to deal with, people who were spitting and cussing at him all day long. But there were people who needed medical care, and he was a very caring person. But the inmates would file claims against him. They would be settled by the city or by the insurance company because they didn't want to deal with the claims. And after 20 years of doing that, he was unemployable because he couldn't get insurance because he had so many claims settled that were filed against him.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the biggest thing that I see would be the problem with, again, what's the criteria for the data entry and who's actually determining if these are substantial enough cases to be logged into these databases.
Yeah, and here's the other question. So you look at an officer who is on a TAC unit, highly trained, seeks out the training and the experience to be one step ahead and be the person that not only the public calls for help, but the police call for help. The logical outcome of that, if they become people who serve high-risk warrants every day, they are going to be involved in more deadly force instances because they are dealing with a very small section of society that is being directed towards that unit for service of a search warrant because they have a higher likelihood of using deadly force against law enforcement or potential to use deadly force against law enforcement. So we take that officer, and over the course of their year, their careers, they've been involved in 5 shootings. All that means is they did exactly what they were trained to do, and they stepped up to fill a gap.
Yeah, nailed it on that one, Lance. Agreed. Another question, just so we know, everybody's we're just a little bit over the hour and a half mark, so we got about 20, 30 minutes left, and we'll try to get as many questions as we can. Jason Cousins, actually, it's one near and dear to my heart. I'll let Lance answer it first, and then I'll follow up. What are your thoughts on repeat psychological evaluations for law enforcement officers? Do you think would help a seasoned law enforcement officer in making decisions on use of force?
No.
Yeah,
I don't. I think what helps officers make decisions on use of force is training and experience and realistic training as much as possible. The repeat psychological evaluations, and it's really interesting. I read one the other day, and I was like, they must be very wet because they don't have sense enough to come in out of the rain. They said, what we demand that officers have psychological evaluations before they wear a badge. I don't know of a single agency that holds a mirror up and says, if you can fog this, we'll give you a gun.
Correct.
I mean, it's absurd, but that's what people, that's what passes for knowledge. And I'll give you an example of how those folks were wrong. But the bottom line, Jason, what is an evaluation? And that's one of the issues that we get into. An officer gets into a shooting and people say, we want a fitness for duty done. They haven't done anything that's outside of what you trained and paid them to do.
Yep.
So evaluating to make sure they're sleeping, evaluating to making sure that they're okay with this, that they can still do their job? Absolutely. But that's not a psychological evaluation because they did something untoward and you believe that they need to be sidelined. And that's what a lot of people are pushing for. Now, I'll give you an example of this. I wrote an editorial a few years ago about tasers. So if you remember, about 10, 12 years ago in Georgia, people wanted to ban tasers because tasers have 50,000 volts and they're going to electrocute people. I can tell you what's kind of funny. People talk about tasers and, if they think a taser is going to electrocute you, you obviously did not take any type of a class involving electricity. And I recommend you not do a lot of wiring around your house. But, everybody listening to this has licked a 9-volt battery. If you have an older brother, you did it more than once. A taser is powered by a 9-volt battery. It is not going to electrocute you. So let's go back 12 years ago. We had people that wanted to ban tasers because they were evil. And now those same people, when an officer gets into a shooting, what do they say? Why didn't they use a taser? Here is the reason for, and this sounds very lawyerly, here's the reason for the dichotomy. And here's the actual reason. They were ignorant to start with, and they're still ignorant. They didn't know what a taser does. They don't know how a taser affects people. They don't know why the taser is used by the officer and how it fits in to the use of force regimen or menu that every officer is trained with. So, we see all these examples of what people should do and what officers should have and what equipment they should have, and take this away from them, and they don't know what they're doing. It had to do with the 1031 exchanges. While the Obama administration was taking armored personnel carriers that had been deconditioned, but when they were talking about taking armored personnel carriers away from agencies in Georgia, the San Bernardino Police Department was in a running gun battle with two terrorists. The officers were only safe because they were using an armored personnel carrier to try to take them into custody.
Yep, and you nailed it on that, Lance. We actually we brought up that in the whole militarization. You got these quotes of that of police, and how people think they're being issued all these government weapons and all this crazy stuff. And I challenge somebody, because you always hear these statements of people being like, "Oh, the police departments are being issued tanks." You show me an M1 Abrams tank. You show me a police department vehicle with a no BS turret that can shoot a projectile out of it, and I will agree that police officers have tanks. Armored personnel vehicles, I've, thank goodness, had them to be able to utilize them on several high-risk search warrants when I was a police officer. And it makes a big difference in keeping you safe, which is what we're trying to do for everybody, and trying to end the situation as safely as possible. Back to Jason's question about the psychological exams. Lance hit on it a little bit. I'm kind of giving my personal experience. Post-shooting, yes, they're great. Lance can probably correct me if I'm wrong. I'm pretty sure every police department that I know of requires you to get a post-shooting evaluation from somebody to allow you to go back to duty. And it's not to be sure, you did anything wrong. It's just basically make sure you're okay in dealing with it well. Thankfully, Lance recommended me somebody good to go see, and I saw them. And, it was somebody I could talk to that knew what I was kind of going through. And, yeah, it makes a big difference. But as far as the mandatory stuff, Lance nailed it on the head. I disagree. I don't think you should have to go through them constantly because, again, you're doing a job. So if you're having other issues that require you to go see one, sure, go see one. But in my opinion, no, repeated, I don't think so. And Dee Dee, real quick, and I'll let you follow up. James, so I'm sure you know that she asked a question because the president's executive order on safe policing requires it. I guess they're trying to establish the database, so it's happening now, and that's why she was asking.
Yeah. So getting to the psychological evaluations, my answer right away would be just like Lance. It would be an absolute no. And the reason I would say that is because I just don't have the most faith in adding an additional kind of step, we'll say, in the process. And it's very dependent on one other person's opinion of how they feel like they're receiving information from said law enforcement officer. So you're just adding additional, potential steps into the process, and you're allowing a lot of human error involved in that. And I just don't know how fair that would be to the officers. But as with any job or any requirement or any interview that you may do, officers have different personalities. They have different ways that they, process things. They have, so one guy's going to be more nervous than the other guy when they're answering questions. And you just don't want, you'd have to look at specifically exactly what criteria are you trying to gather from this officer. And if you don't have a really dead set criteria and you're leaving it up to someone else's opinion, I just think there's too much human error involved in there. And again, you could be, taking jobs away from very qualified officers.
Well, and another, my wife and I founded a group it's a nonprofit in Cobb County called the Cobb County Public Safety Foundation. And, we basically have a mission called REST. We do relief for officers, whether that's financial relief or whatever, education, support in the form of psychological counseling, debriefs, financial support, and also training. And what we've seen, and this is where people have started to understand, there's a difference between post-traumatic stress disorder and post-traumatic stress. Post-traumatic stress is a normal response to a horrible situation. So an officer gets to the scene of a traffic accident. They're expecting, okay, so there's going to be some bashed up cars in the roadway. And they see a child who's been injected because they were not properly buckled in. And, an infant that was not in a car seat. They were sitting in somebody's lap, the seatbelt, the airbag deployed and killed the child. There is no way that a normal human being will not be affected by that. And law enforcement officers over the course of their lives and their careers, just like soldiers who have been in combat, just like, people who have been through horrible situations in their lives. That's not just part of their life story. It takes a toll. I could still tell you what that room smelled like July 10th of 1990. And there's a lot of other situations like that. I've talked to officers who've been involved in shootings 40 years later, and they still tear up when they think about it. In When Cops Kill, I interviewed somebody who'd been involved in a shooting, and he wound up shooting someone who shot and killed 2 police officers. It was a justified shooting by any measure. And it was 15 years later, and he said his goal was to go 24 hours without thinking about the man he killed. And after 15 years, he hadn't been able to do it yet. So when you start talking about doing psychological evaluations, and James, you hit the nail on the head, are we going to evaluate that person and say, okay, the norm is the guy who sat at his desk for the past 15 years and wrote code. And we're going to evaluate the 15-year police officer against that. They'll probably fail. Yep. Because what they've seen and what they've dealt with and the amount of stress that they have had to work their way through has changed them. But what it comes down to is it doesn't change the fact that, they are still good police officers. They're able to do their jobs. And it's really kind of funny. We talked before about who's making these recommendations. The same people who make the recommendations about doing psychological evaluations just on every law enforcement officer every year apparently can't spell ADA, because you can't just do psychological evaluations and fire people because they didn't pass a standard, especially if you have no reason other than, it's January, go see the shrink.
Also, who's the psychologist that's going to, and what are their biases when they're interviewing these officers as well? So that's why I feel like it's too much. There's too much room for error if you bring an additional step in the process.
Yeah, and what's missing a lot from this too is just the reality of what it's like to be an officer. And Eric and I were talking about this earlier. I set out, I've written several books, and the Parallax is now available in an audiobook, but it's a series of 5 short stories. And Parallax is short stories based on law enforcement. They're all fiction. Some of them have some, they might have some relationships to things that I actually heard or talked about or met people or experienced myself. But I went and wrote a book, the first full-length novel. It's called Hunting of Men. And Hunting of Men, you can go to huntingofmen.com. Hunting of Men is about a very new detective. He's very new to the department, very sharp, gets assigned to homicide. And this particular department has a tradition. When you get assigned to homicide, you have to go pick out a cold case. Well, without realizing it, he winds up picking out a cold case that has to do with the murder of a law enforcement officer on duty. So you could imagine what it would be like for an agency. And I thought about this. God, I had seen officers killed in my department. Imagine what it would be like to have a crime like that couldn't be solved and how that would affect the agency. So Johnny Till is the main character. It's part of the Blue Mystery series. And he goes through and solves the crime, and also discovers a sex trafficking ring, which is a complete scourge on our society. And I was interviewed about it, and they said, first they said, well, are you Johnny Till? And I said, no, Johnny Till's much smarter and better looking than I am, I can assure you. But, they said, well, what's the book like? I said, well, if you want to read a book about the age-old detective who's an alcoholic, who can't hold a relationship down, hates their chief, and punches suspects all the time, then this is not the book for you. If you want to learn how real cops solve crime and what cops are like and how funny they are and how different they are, one cop that I worked with used to go home and paint oil paintings at night. That was his zen. And I've worked with cops who were so funny, I had to turn the radio down because I was laughing so hard just talking to them in a patrol car. It really talks about the struggles officers go through and what it's like to find somebody who's been victimized in a crime and what a toll it takes. So huntingofmen.com, the book came out in January. It's selling very well, and I think people will really enjoy it.
Awesome. So let's this kind of last point will take us, I guess, full circle where we started. So along the lines of defund the police, all these, we need more highly trained police officers and all this other stuff. Now we're getting this sudden call for non-law enforcement officers being designated to answer non-violent, non-dangerous calls up to and including suicidal people, drunks, I think domestic disputes in some areas was on there, which is mind blowing. And I believe city of Berkeley in California is proposing, and I think approved, a measure to have non-citizens conduct traffic stops on vehicles. Can you give me any kind of rationale, what the thought process would be behind something like this, especially when we're calling for more highly trained police officers to be out there doing these kind of enforcements?
So if you're looking for the rational basis of it, the only thing that I can tell you is this, and I've been seeing it for years. People want to exert control over what they control. If you want to control crime, tell athletes to stop bashing police and tell them to go into schools and inner cities and neighborhoods where most people wouldn't go on a bet with their doors locked and keep kids from getting involved in gangs. The biggest threat to people in the United States and their safety and their livelihoods is not law enforcement, it's gang members. They're out of control in the United States. And when we're talking about having civilians do traffic stops, that measure is born of, well, officers wind up stopping people and these situations go bad, so it's got to be the officer's fault. And again, it's that control thing. So I'll give you an example of just how misleading this is. There was a study done by a former psychological counselor for the LAPD. His name is Mohindi. And he looked at 700 police shootings in 90 different jurisdictions. Now, when you take 90 different jurisdictions, you take out the differences in the policies and procedures and the nuances in the law between this state and another. He looked at 700 of those shootings. When they went in to do a serious deep dive on those shootings, they found out that 36% of those were suicide by cop.
Yep. Even
though they weren't recognized to be so. So what does a deep dive mean? It means they went in and realized that even though the police didn't realize it at the time, or maybe didn't figure out the investigation, the person had been fired. They had been sued. They had their kids taken away from them. Divorce was filed. A TPO was filed. They recognized they were going to have to declare bankruptcy. They had a fundamental change. And the scary thing getting to these civilians doing these jobs, only 8% of those 36% that were suicide by cop were dispatched as suicide calls.
Yep.
So the person used that opportunity to press the contact. Kind of going back to what I told James before, take the most calm person with martial arts experience that would never get into anything. They do it for fitness. They love what they do. You can push them hard enough to get them to hit you. Well, if you are not dealing with a situation of de-escalation, you're dealing with a situation where the officer gets there, and whether you're wearing a uniform, whether you're a civilian or not, you are going to press that situation into a deadly force encounter. You will get your wish. Now, scary thing about those 700 situations that were tested, okay? 36% of them found to be suicide by cop. In 50% of the situations, the person had never verbalized a suicidal ideation ever.
Wow.
So now we see officer gets to the scene of a domestic dispute. What's the domestic dispute? I don't know. This guy's just going crazy next door. Officer knocks on the door next door, opens the door. Guy runs at him. Actually, situation happened in Alabama. Officer opens the door, and a guy came out with a bush axe and amputated the officer's hand with the bush axe. The second officer shoots him and kills him. So we're doing a deep dive on that, and the media is doing a deep dive. But like I said, they have time pressure. They don't have the ability to vet some of these witnesses. They don't have the ability to look at the background of the person as much as law enforcement's going to, because they have time on their side. And we go and interview their families and friends, and their family and friends says, they never told us they were thinking about committing suicide. 50% of the time, not a single ideation. And that's where we have that disconnect, where that narrative starts. And this is what I talk about in Blue News. Law enforcement needs to take control of the narrative early. We have that disconnect that starts a narrative that the officers showed up because they were there, the situation escalated, and it ended in a death. And that, Eric, is the only way that I can see people are saying law enforcement, we're going to back them off, and we're going to send people who are non-law enforcement civilians. I can tell you right now, when I was policing, if you told me I didn't have to go to a single domestic dispute because because a social worker would go, yep, I'd be all on board for that. But here's the issue. You call 911 and a 911 operator who has to decide, they are absolute heroes behind a telephone. They are your lifeline to survival. In 35 seconds, they have to decide whether it's deadly or not, whether it's dangerous. And now they decide how much time do they spend on the phone with a matrix. Well, James has a PhD in counseling. Eric's got a PhD in family counseling. You know, they said that there's weapons in the house and the person's been violent before, but they're not violent now. So who do we send? And if you want the proof of how ridiculous this is, I read that article too. What do they say those unarmed civilians will do if something goes bad?
Call the police.
Call the police. Now look at traffic stops that turn deadly. By the time the police get there, they will be drawing chalk lines.
Oh, 100%. 100%. There's no time for that reaction.
And by the way, that's the difference between a guardian and a warrior. Warriors prevent homicide. Guardians carry a lot of chalk around, so they make sure they draw the chalk lines.
Yep. James?
Yeah, no, I couldn't imagine. Number one, I guess there's people that are willing to go do this job, or they're willing to be the first couple of guinea pigs to go take this call. The whole idea in itself, it just leaves me at a loss for words, to be honest with you. And again, we've talked about reaction time and response time, and of course, if you're going to send someone out, you can't wait and have a secondary stage where they call the police in to try to come handle the situation that you couldn't handle. And as soon as one of these social workers, or whatever they want to call them, as soon as one of those guys get killed or something happens to them in any fashion, who are we pointing the finger at then? Who are we yelling at then? I'm sure we'll pass the buck over and blame it on someone else. And I would imagine it'd probably go back to law enforcement. They would probably point the finger right back and say, okay, well, you guys, or the dispatch, you should have known better than to send them out here. It's just asking for disaster. I'll just say it. It's the silliest thing I've heard coming out of any potential law enforcement activity. So that's where I stand on it. It's silly.
Yeah, I'm with you, James. I guess we're hitting right at the 2-hour mark. So, I don't have too much to follow up on other than, and I'm going to let Lance have the final word. For those of you that are wondering about law enforcement, doubting law enforcement, and wondering the process, I think Lance made some very good points. Give them time. They're doing thorough investigations. I've always told people this. You would want them to investigate those cases just like they would investigate if it was one of your family members, God forbid, that had something terrible happen to them. You would want them to be as thorough as you could if it was you involved, and making all the right decisions, dotting all the I's, crossing all the T's. Give them time. Let the professionals do their job. Don't just hop on something that the box on your wall tells you that you should believe. Wait, get the facts in front of you, then make your decision and your assumption. I think too much in this country, we have knee-jerk reactions. We're emotional reactions constantly. And I think that's a huge part of the problem of why people are jumping on the bandwagon. Some people are jumping on the bandwagon. They are now with all this and screaming, all these mottos and phrases and things that they're dangerous to say. Again, we talked about the Constitution. We believe in free speech here, but it's very dangerous, the path we're walking down. And I'll just kind of leave Lance with the final thoughts, and we'll wrap it up from there.
Sure. As somebody said recently, I can do without a certain coffee chain. I could do without a certain product. I could do without a lot of different things. But the bottom line is we can't do without the police. So what I would tell people, if you are part of the overwhelming majority that support law enforcement, go find one and thank them. And thank them for being there. Support them. When people are bashing them, write a letter to the editor. Write a letter to their chief and thank them for stopping to change your tire on the side of the road. And if you're in law enforcement, read Blue News and tell your own story, because if you don't tell your story, someone else will. There are men and women in this country that are devoted to public safety and public service. And thank God every day they go to work. And I can tell you, if we don't do something to keep them, we will be in that world of anarchy that we were talking about, and nobody wants that.
Yep. James?
Yeah, no. So number one, we'll say definitely want to say thank you to Lance for coming out and being on the show. I spoke with a lot of people earlier today and over the week since we've been broadcasting that we were going to have Lance on the show today, and many of these people expressed to me that if they couldn't catch it live, they're going to be catching it on YouTube, and it stays up on Facebook as well. So definitely want to thank Lance for coming on the show. For all the viewers, if you are just now catching the tail end of it, of course, you'll be able to watch it, not in real time or not live, but you will be able to see the recordings that we have. They do stay up on Facebook and YouTube, like I said. If you're law enforcement, military, you guys stay safe, and we're always here, kind of putting in a good word for you, and we'll continue to do so as long as they'll keep us on the air.
Yeah. Thank you to everybody. And again, thank you, Lance. We appreciate your time. It's good being able to do long form discussions like this to where, you can get your points across thoroughly, like you said, without being stuck to a time crunch and a time frame. So we greatly appreciate you spending now just over 2 hours with us. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a lot of fun.
Yes, sir. And thanks, everybody. Catch us next week. Like James said, follow us on YouTube, Facebook. I'll post the links on our webpage. And again, thank you, everybody.